Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our Beyond the Microscope webinar series. My name is Olu Ibrahim, and I'm the founder and executive director of Kids in Tech. We'd love to know where you're joining us from today, so please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, tell us your name, and where in the world you're joining us from today. Since our founding in 2016, Kids in Tech has been committed to exciting, educating, and empowering young children to acquire the skills and confidence in technology through interactive after-school programs. Our programs focus on helping kids develop the necessary tech skills and aptitudes to participate in and be future leaders of the 21st century innovation economy. Due to the historical national crises greatly exacerbated by COVID-19, it's important now more than ever we explore what does the future of education hold for our nation's children, and how do we ensure that our kids reach their full potential? This four-part webinar series is dedicated to topics about education, science, technology, innovation, and business through the voices of folks directly involved in those fields. The goal of this series is to spark conversation and discuss how we can all work together to ensure that our nation's children is successful and truly reach their full potential. In our first webinar, we focus on how Kids in Tech has been able to create a pipeline of diverse leaders to engage in STEM, gaining skills and practical knowledge to become future leaders in science and tech at an early age. Today, our second webinar will explore the importance of art in STEM education. In ancient Greece, the words technique and technology are derived from the word techne. Art and science are closely intertwined, yet we often think of them as separate and distinct. Science itself is art, and there is a science to art itself. In today's session, we will take a closer look at how engaging the creative brain through arts education can enhance and improve STEAM education. This part of the program will be a 45-minute panel where we'll try to take as many questions as we can throughout the discussion. And then our moderators and panelists will also lead everyone through an interactive activity that helps us understand where art and science truly intersect. Our sincere thanks to our generous sponsors for the series, SoftWorld and the Boston Globe, who made this series possible. And now a word for Maura Mohan, the Director of Human Resources from SoftWorld.
Hi, thank you, Olu. As Olu said, my name is Maura Mohan, and I'm the Director of HR here at SoftWorld. We are a staffing agency that focuses on placing technical professionals, mainly in the areas of IT, engineering, and life sciences. Being in this industry, we see firsthand the large gap within the STEAM fields, and we are really passionate about taking part in programs like Kids in Tech, where we can help to move the needle with education and resources that are making way towards eliminating the divide and increasing representation in these fields. We are super honored to be here today. Thank you for having us, and back to you, Olu.
Thank you, Maura and SoftWorld. And a special thanks to our media sponsor, the Boston Globe. The Boston Globe is a 26-time Pulitzer Prize winning news source featuring premium and national and local content daily. With the largest newsroom in the region, the Boston Globe provides more news, analysis, and information about community events, sports, and entertainment than any other local news source. And now it's time to dive into today's panel. Everyone, you're truly in for a treat. This part of the panel program will be 45 minutes. Please put your questions in the Q&A chat box, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible during this part of the conversation. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Veronica Chow. Veronica Chow is the Boston Globe's Deputy Managing Editor, Living Arts, overseeing the Globe's Weekend and Sunday Arts section and the Sunday Globe magazine. She has mentored young women through the Aspire and All Ray Scholars Program and has served as an officer for the local chapter of the Asian American Journalists Association. A graduate of the University of Virginia, she was previously on the board of the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center and has volunteered with the Chinatown Neighborhood Center. Veronica, welcome, and please take it away.
Thank you, Olu, and welcome to all of you out there. I'm seeing your messages pop up on the chat, and it's great to see people coming from all over, including Argentina. Looks like no, based in North Carolina. So welcome to all of you. I'm really delighted to be here with you today, representing the Boston Globe to moderate this. It's an excellent panel that Kids in Tech has put together on the importance of arts and STEM education. The panelists have met a few times in preparing for today, and I can tell you that this is a phenomenally accomplished group of women, all with different backgrounds, all working in different careers, but they share this deep interest in education and education and learning and the intersection of arts and technology. I think it's going to be a truly light and lively and enlightening discussion. And I'm going to start by introducing you to these five panelists. First up is Courtney Savoy Harper. She was raised in Washington, D.C. She was born in Washington, D.C. and raised in Columbia, Maryland. She went to Hampton University to follow her love of the arts and went on to George Washington University to study art education. Education is Courtney's lifelong passion, and she is currently an art teacher at Coolidge High School in the DC Public Schools, and she's an art instructor for the Smithsonian's Hirshhorn Museum, where she teaches augmented reality to high school students from schools all over the city. Courtney is also a practicing art professional. She specializes in mural illustrations and company branding, and her work can be found on school walls and in embassies in our nation's capital. She is also an active member of the Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Inc. and the funder and founder of the annual Savoy Legacy Scholarship. Welcome, Courtney. So glad you're here with us. Next up is Vanessa Ruiz. She is an artist, designer, and curator with a passion for making learning about health and medicine engaging through art, design, and technology. She loves working with diverse creative teams to deliver world-class user experiences and brand strategies across mediums, and she prioritizes curiosity and artistry throughout that process. Vanessa has an extensive background in healthcare advertising and marketing, in digital health and patient engagement. While earning her master's in biomedical visualization at the University of Illinois at Chicago, she founded Street Anatomy, which is a website that aggregates works at the intersection of contemporary art and human anatomy. She has curated several anatomically themed gallery shows in Chicago, and in 2015, she was a speaker at TEDMed and currently serves on their editorial advisory board. She is also a member of the Association of Medical Illustrators. Next, we have Nabiha Saglayan. She is a bio-inspired physicist and entrepreneur. She launched her company Seleno to converge physics, biology, and machine learning to enable paradigm shifts in autologous regenerative medicine. Seleno is building a proprietary platform technology that makes personalized stem cell derived therapies scalable for the first time. Nabiha received her PhD in physics from Harvard as an HHMI International Fellow. She was recognized as a pioneer in MIT Tech Review's 35 Innovators Under 35 list for her inventions in laser-based delivery methods, and she is on the 2019 Forbes Under 30 list for healthcare. She has made significant contributions to the field of pulsed laser delivery to cells with peer-reviewed papers, patents pending, and grants awarded. She grew up in Saudi Arabia, Bangladesh, Germany, and Sri Lanka. She co-created the I Am a Scientist program to break barriers in STEAM, and in her free time, she enjoys painting. Our fourth panelist is Stephanie Fine-Sassy. Hi, Stephanie. She has worked as a neuroscience and psychology researcher at Oregon Health and Science University and Harvard University, with an emphasis on understanding emotion and decision-making in the brain. She has a master's of education in mind-brain education from Harvard. And while at Harvard, she created award-winning workshops on science, communication, and information literacy, which were presented on campuses nationwide. Stephanie has more than 10 years working in educational experience and exhibition design, with an emphasis on interactive art, impact design, and science communication. In 2017, she was program director for the March for Science in San Francisco. And she is also the founder of the Plenary Co., which is an arts and education nonprofit that designs collaborative and creative ways for the public to explore social, scientific, and environmental issues. Finally, we have Folashade Cromwell Solomon, who earned her doctorate in education from Harvard and has over 20 years of experience in education. Currently, she's an associate professor of education at Framingham State University and a senior scientist at Turk, which is a STEM think tank in Cambridge. Her teaching and research focus on learning, identity, and exploring the connections between the arts and STEM. Her recent work, Embodied Physics, STEM Learning for Underrepresented Youth, was funded by the National Science Foundation, and it explores how dance can be a site for learning physics for urban youth. Her most recent publications include Embodied Learning Through Dance and Physics, published in Hands-On, and a forthcoming paper, Embodied Resources for Learning and Engagement in STEM. Previously, Folashade was a third grade teacher for 9 years, and she has been a dancer all of her life. So welcome to all of our panelists. Before we start the discussion, we have a little hands-on activity for you. I think we're going to show you a slide here. So if you can grab a piece of paper and pencil, we are inviting you to take a minute or two to draw a Venn diagram. This is an activity courtesy of our panelist, Stephanie. So making a diagram like the one you see on your screen, we're asking you to use this as a way to think about the ways that arts and science are distinct and the ways that they are similar. So we're going to fill this in now, take a few minutes, and then at the end, we'll go back, ask you to go back and look at it and see if your thinking has changed at all about these circles and what's in them. In the left-hand circle, you can write everything that you think of as uniquely art. And in the right-hand circle, write down everything that you think of as uniquely science. And in the middle, of course, noting what you think those two spheres have in common. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to do that. I've already filled mine out. So we'll take a couple of minutes on that, and then we'll dive into the discussion. Okay. So I'm going to start with some questions. We have questions for the panel, of course, but like Olu said, we're going to take questions, try to take questions as we go along. So please do post anything in the Q&A function that comes up as we talk, and we'll try to address some of those. Some things people may, our panelists may write back to you. In other cases, we're going to try to talk about the questions as we go. And I think we're actually going to go until, we said we'd keep talking until 1:25 before we wrap up, since we're going to incorporate those questions. Okay, so first up, this is first question is, why does STEM education and arts education go together? How do they relate and connect to one another? And I would like to start with you, Courtney, with your classroom and practicing artist perspective. Could you answer that question?
Yes, this is my favorite topic. How do they go together? Art is the foundation of science, tech, and engineering and math. Whether you explain it or not, it's there. It's really about how you view what art is. So design and creation and evaluation is the highest form of mastery in science, technology, engineering, and math. Project-based real-life scenarios, connecting to humanitarian and social justice ideas and wanting to make a difference in the world with creation and design. Creating art should be the goal for all content educators, especially if you want that engagement and that intrinsic love of learning. When you know why, it's just different. So the why is art.
Anybody want to add to that? Neighbor panelists like to jump in?
I love this question. And, looking at my Venn diagram, I think that for me, spoiler alert, for me, two of the major meeting points of art and science are creativity and inquiry. And I think that there's this major misconception in society that art is about creativity and science is about inquiry. And I think that that's a major disservice, both to our collective pursuit of truth and to the students who may be more creative and not see themselves reflected in the way that STEM is taught, or be more curious and not see themselves reflected in the way that art is taught. When we look throughout history, some of the leading artists and scientists have been both and embody both. And I think it's really exciting to find ways to draw those together and integrate them more, because they create an invitation for students from both the creative and more curious pursuits to see themselves in both fields.
I'd like to add to that. I actually feel like the connections between arts and science are, building off of what Stephanie said, allow anyone, a learner, to really engage in various ways of making sense of the ideas that they're exploring. And so having, artistic habits that, that we use, or that we're more inclined to use as modes of, inquiring into a particular idea, just gets us closer to connecting with the topics that we're exploring. And so I like how they're like two sides of the same coin, art and science.
I think back to Stephanie's point, it's important to take a historic view because this is not a new concept. And I think the subject of anatomy is a great example. And throughout history, anatomists relied on artists. So here's a collaboration between scientists and artists to help visualize their discoveries and communicate that to the public. And advances in the understanding of human anatomy really took off in the 16th century, when anatomists and artists drew from direct observation of cadavers. And then with the invention of the printing press around a similar time, books were easier to make and spread around the world, making education available to more people. And so there's a perfect example of the interplay between art, science, and technology to disseminate knowledge. And that goes beyond anatomy to perhaps all of the scientific subjects. So once you start to intertwine art and STEM, I believe that you spark a much deeper curiosity and connection to whatever subject you're in.
Abiha, anything to add?
Hey, yes, absolutely. I was also looking at my Venn diagram, and most of the words, actually all of them, fell in the middle for me of the overlap of the Venn diagram. And that's how I see things. I'm very classically trained physicist, I suppose, in the sense I went through all my physics training, but in parallel, art was a very important part of my life and something that I draw inspiration from on a daily basis. I'm on vacation right now for a few days, and I didn't bring anything science related, but I brought my watercolors with me to re-energize from that. And I really see them to be very synergistic, and they always have been. And it's so much about creativity, whether it's on the science side or the art side. And there's this beautiful energy between the two that I feed off of. And it's inspiring for me. It gives me a lot of energy to keep pushing and doing hard things. I mean, one thing that came up as I was doing the Venn diagram exercise was art and science can both be fun, but they can both be really challenging. They both require a lot of dedication. They require creativity. They can be project-based. They can require teamwork. And that's what you learn by doing both things in parallel. So I think there really is an opportunity for STEM education and arts education to really run in parallel, so we can transfer these skill sets and really cross-pollinate in students to get them inspired to do both, because it's really beneficial. At least for me, it has been.
So looking at the questions that are coming in, one person asked, how can we convince others of the importance of art? So that kind of assumes that people don't need persuading or see, the importance of science and technology. How do we persuade them that art is important too?
I believe at a policy level, in schools and in education, I think we need to be more intentional with the standards and the language that we use. Like I mentioned earlier, design and creation are the highest forms of understanding. Creating is art. Whenever you're designing and thinking and processing, and documenting, you're creating art, and we need to be more intentional when we use that language in education.
Anybody else on that?
I also see the connections there between exploring inquiry and rigor. Like you said, there's a way that we hide the rigor, or we don't talk about the rigor in the arts, and that supports this view that it's soft in some way. And I just know that that is not the case. And so for me, it's also about showing that if we really do value, learning in even in STEM, if that's what they privilege, we can't get everybody there if we're not really thinking about how all people learn and connect with those ideas. And I see a really strong opportunity to engage with something that maybe people feel more that they can be more creative in, because I think we often not silo, but kind of restrict how we see the STEM fields, but are more expansive in how we see art fields. So I think that sometimes we need to kind of expand both, to really see what opportunities there are for young people to, well, I relate to young people, so for young people to really engage and learn how to make connections with their arts and the things that they love, in order to maybe engage in some of the things that they find to be more challenging. So trying to find those connections.
Yeah, and if I may add to that, I agree with everything that y'all said. And I think for me personally, I went through this where growing up, I was like, oh, I came from a family where sometimes the messaging was like, don't focus on the fluffy stuff too much. And art got kind of put into that category, even though I loved it. I loved creative expression and writing and any form of creativity. And it wasn't until I got to know more scientists and got into a science lab and experience myself that I realized just how deeply creative STEM is. And it's not to say art should ever be in service of STEM. They're distinct in certain ways that are extremely important to hold at equal respect individually. But what I found was that the value that I had placed on art increased when I started to hear more stories about the intersection that a single individual could have between art and science. So the scientists who spoke about the role of creativity in their work and how arts education informed their work, as well as learning from artists who do incredible inquiry work and them talking about their path through STEM. I think for me, adding more value, societal value on the arts as a profession comes from storytelling.
We're going to talk about that in a bit. There are a lot of questions coming in, and I think there's sort of along a same theme, which was my next question was about how might a student who's drawn to STEM subjects benefit from exposure to arts education? And I was wondering, Folashade, if you could kick us off with some examples to help us understand what that learning looks like. I know you have experience with this. The questions coming in from attendees are, about integrating art into your classes if there's no specific art at your school. But maybe you can start by just generally talking about what, some specific examples of what this looks like, combining these two things.
Sure. So I think in one respect, in classrooms where I work with teachers, I see that, especially in science classrooms, I see that there are particular ways that we represent scientific ideas. For example, like a life cycle of a butterfly or something like that, if we're working with young children. But there are opportunities really to explore those scientific ideas using various modes. And we talk in education about, increasing the modes that we use in order to really engage all learners. And so, art can help us afford entry points into accessing those modes. So, if you draw a picture of a life cycle, if you embody the life cycle and represent it in a story with your body, you can gain access as a thinker to perspective take and to think about what it is that is actually happening in this concept or within this scientific phenomena. So the idea is that we can use multiple modes to engage our learners, so that they have different ways of representing the ideas, different ways of making sense of the ideas, and ultimately just getting closer, closer to understanding some things that may feel more abstract.
I think
And so I think, the more we can, allow our students to engage in different ways, maybe not just in terms of memorization, into looking and exploring the science. We get more buy-in in science, right? So we get more enthusiasm around science, and most of those, the winners of all of the prized awards have that creativity and excitement and embodied imagining, if you will, that they use with their science. But that's kind of hidden sometimes from us in terms of how we conceive science. And so I think the idea is to use those multiple modes as a way to both make sense of the material as well as represent the material.
Yeah, I can add on, strong in that idea should be the planning portion. And in that planning portion, again, that idea of being very intentional of how we're going to use art, so it's not an accident. Oh, did you know you used art right there? You already know that you used art. And in collaboration. So as an educator, I know how difficult our day-to-day is. So it can be easy to say, oh, just have all the teachers, all the content teachers go to professional development about art, how to integrate it in the classroom. I think it should be a community effort. I love that a lot of our panelists push into the schools and help the schools and integrate with the teacher and co-teach with the teacher and show them intentionally how art will be used there. So when we're visualizing what art looks like in the classroom, it's not a surprise or a mistake that we stumbled upon. We already know where we're going with it. Of course, there'll be changes. That's part of the process of things changing and going off into other places. And that is exactly what science is. And we do that in art as well, and investigation. Yeah.
So there's another question from an attendee asking what advice you would have for a high schooler who enjoys both art and science and is sort of trying to decide a career path, how do you advise a student who enjoys both things and has skill in both things?
I would say that there's an entire field of art as applied to medicine and science that includes these careers that are a perfect balance of both. So medical illustration, botanical illustration, science storytelling, data visualization, augmented reality, virtual reality, and gaming. So I've talked to students who are struggling with this dichotomy of going either into art or going into science and medicine, not knowing that there's a perfect blend between the two, and you have your place in the world that really, lives to your values and your purpose. So I think and I didn't learn about the field of medical illustration until I was way in college. And had I known about it earlier on, had I been exposed to it, I think I would have been just more prepared and sort of enjoyed both science and art throughout my education.
Do you think that's getting better? Those of you who have experience in schools, I mean, do you think now it's easier there's more information about careers like that?
I think there are in certain communities, I still find that there are these really, strong boundaries that we have and react to when I'm working with teenagers. I often will hear them say, like, "Oh, I'm not a math person," or "I'm not, a science person," or even, sometimes I hear parents saying that about their kids. Well, I can't help them with math, or I can't help them with science. But I think, if we can get away from that, I would just say that, like, science, math it's everywhere, right? And so you can talk about buoyancy in the bathtub, or you can, you know what I mean, you could talk about your favorite things you do with your family. If do you sail, do you go on walks in the forest, like, it's all around us, but somehow I think we separate kind of just knowledge in our everyday from that what we do in school. So I think that's one of the things that make it more difficult.
We have some work to do. We got a lot of work to do. Seeing a lot of the questions, and the earlier question already said of how can we convince people. The only art teacher in my school, I'm constantly, it's tiring, but I'm going to continue on and convincing the adults. It's not a student problem. And that's why I mentioned earlier, at a policy level, like, it has to actually be implemented strongly that art is important, and that will help ensure the buy-in from children starting at the adult level.
And is there anything that parents can do? There's a question here about, changing policy and sort of having an influence at school. I mean, how do they get that done?
Yes, definitely. It's the community meetings, the budget meetings, what do they want to cut first? And showing up strong and not taking that, and speaking your word, and lobbying and surveys. Every school has a panel of community and parents, and sit on it. Right now, it would be easier virtually, I imagine. So that's a way you can start.
Okay, I'm going to move to our next question, which is, I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more, if you could each talk a little bit more about your careers, so that we can understand better, like, how you apply these things. If you could each sort of give an example of the way you draw from both STEM and the arts in your own work. And Vanessa, we've heard a little bit about your experience, but maybe you could kick us off with this.
Sure, happy to. So as mentioned before, I trained as a medical illustrator, which is that sort of that perfect balance of art and science that helps me visualize every aspect of the human body, from the skin all the way down to the cells and molecules that make our bodies function. And my job is as a director of design at a biotech-focused design agency. And so I communicate complex science into simplicity through a range of media and platforms. And every day I get to work with animators, writers, designers, UX designers, and medical illustrators who are able to visualize and communicate the unseen. And that's so important for everybody. I mean, you see what's in front of you, but how do you communicate what you literally cannot see, and nobody's seen before? For example, creating an animation on how a drug works in the body at the cellular and molecular level, or designing a very simple diagram of a complex signaling pathway in the body. We're able to visualize and communicate what scientists research and study. But doing that accurately actually takes a lot of research in and of itself, and therefore a scientific mindset. And communicating it effectively takes an effective storytelling approach, which I know we'll touch on later. But again, that's where you get that perfect interplay between science and art.
Nabiha, would you like to go next?
Absolutely. Yes, I'm thinking of so many different instances where science and art blend together for me, but I'll reflect on one particular case. Also, there are so many different kinds of art. Um, that's how, there's music, there's writing, there's poetry, there's theater. And growing up, I was interested in all of those things. And in high school, I really either wanted to be a writer or an aerospace engineer, and couldn't really decide which way to go, but then decided, okay, I really want to do something physics related. It was really challenging for me. I was motivated, but I kept doing a lot of writing throughout my career, high school, college, grad school. It was very interesting because during my PhD at Harvard, I had this incredible opportunity to work on a book with the former president of MIT, Susan Hockfield. Her book is called The Age of Living Machines, How Biology Will Build the Next Scientific Revolution. And that was very interesting because we were writing about science, but we also worked with amazing illustrators to convey the scientific principles in all the different chapters. And really being her thought partner and writing partner in that process it was one of the highlights of my career so far, because I'd never really gotten to write in that intensive form before, but to be able to do that for science, and being a good writer is so important, and being able to convey those incredible ideas around important topics like energy, healthcare, global warming. We covered so many different topics in the book, and being able to convey those ideas was so important. So I think that's maybe one of the projects that I've done in the past several years that really was a perfect balance of many different things related to art and science. And there was no other way to do it. You had to find balance. And I was very grateful that Susan was just as passionate about having the artistic component highlighted in the book. It's not always common to have scientific illustrations in a memoir type book, but she really wanted it. So we looked all over the world to find amazing artists, and we ended up working with two artists in the Netherlands, which was also an incredible experience to create those illustrations.
Stephanie?
Sure. So my original training was in neuroscience and psychology research, and I became very interested in how we attach to our beliefs, conceptual change, and emotions and decision making. And I was particularly interested in that because I wanted to understand why there was this gap between the knowledge that we hold about ourselves, about each other, about society, and the way we actually lead our lives and design society. And I wanted to figure out how to close that gap. And so originally I took some pretty conventional approaches to that. I did workshops and trainings and talks and things like that. And it's fine. It worked well, but it wasn't making the impact that I wanted to see. And I remember sitting with a friend of mine who was an artist named Amber Boyd, and we were talking about how frustrating it was that there weren't a lot of opportunities for us to work together on these issues that we both cared so much about. And so we decided to take a step back from this more conventional model that I'd been pursuing and say, what if we just built something grassroots from the ground up that was focused on the mission that we're trying to serve? And in that case, we were interested in teaching and engaging the public with human bias. And so there's this concept that one of the artists I work with now brought to us. His name's Sam Gallison. He talks about medium specificity. And it's the idea that there is a right tool for each job. And so when Amber and I looked at this job of, okay, how do we engage people with this idea of human bias, which can be a really challenging idea for a lot of people to explore comfortably. And we were like, all right, well, what's the best tool for this job? When we actually opened our minds and looked at the possibilities, we found that there were critical insights sort of buried in siloed fields and disciplines across art and across advocacy, across grassroots community knowledge, as well as the sciences. And so we decided to build a show around all of those pieces. And when we actually came and saw the way that people were engaging, it brought in a completely different crowd of people than anything that we'd done in the past, because there were more access points. There were more ways of knowing. It was a multi-sensory experience and exploration. And by bringing in those different points of view, it gave you a closer approximation to truth. And it gave you more ways of exploring and more ways of connecting with the content. So that laid the foundation for what we do now at the plenary. We realized that looking around that room and seeing art and science held with equal respect and esteem mattered. And not just conceptually, but effectively. It made what we were teaching more effective and more accessible and more meaningful.
Well, Sade, anything to add here?
Yeah, I would just say that, just building off of Stephanie's example, I felt like part of my work is around providing access to STEM for underrepresented youth, and one of the big deals about that for me was because as a teacher, I felt like I was experiencing kids, like I said earlier, saying no, they're not a scientist or they're not a mathematician. And partly it was because there are ways that we race the disciplines of STEM, and we also gender the discipline of STEM. And so when I had the opportunity, I was able to integrate arts and STEM, and I know what kind of rigor I what I found from my dance training, and what I learned to learn actually was through my dance experience. And so I wanted to think about, outside of the school, are there spaces that really support that deep learning and investigation, and kind of test that idea. I knew it was true for me in dance and growing up, dancing, but I wonder how we can map on that kind of experience and sense of myself that I got from being a dancer at my community-based dance center, and think about, how do I apply that kind of conditions and that own learning that I developed through those experiences to kind of maybe teach something to, in more formal settings, what they're doing so well in arts-based community environments. And so when I had the chance, I thought about a dance, and I thought about the science embedded and enacted it in dance. And so I developed this embodied physics course that really did just that. It kind of, we distilled some of the choreographic or dance practices, and then we showed our students, like, what is the science, what is the physics involved in these activities. And so, from jumping and turning to, exploring forces and gravity and, torque and all these different, ideas, we got to really help the students see, oh, I'm already doing all of this, and I have this knowing in my body that connects to these scientific ideas. And what can I do with that to really own my dance more, not just for the purpose of, of learning and achieving in a science class, but really, oh, I can be more efficient in my turning if I spot, if I think about where my center of gravity is, if I hold my arms a particular way. And so I think there's a way that I wanted to help young students really see that what they're already doing can help them if they can, get away from those kind of like, oh, this is not for me, and say, oh, I'm a dancer and I do physics or I use physics and I understand physics because I dance. So that's where I wanted my work to kind of intersect with those ideas.
How did they react? What was the students' reaction to that learning?
Well, there's one example that we brought in the periodic table into one of our dance experiences, and we were talking about the behavior of different elements, and we wanted to represent those behaviors. So we talked about, like hydrogen and what it wants to do, and kind of thinking about iron and being low and dense and glow to the ground, or what would that be, heavy, to represent that through dance. And at first the students said, why are you bringing this, this chart that's giving me, PTSD into the dance class? No, I want to really, you know don't do that. It was their first initial response. But then once we kind of showed how the characteristics, can have these we can embody them, represent them in certain ways in a dance way, they were so excited by the end of that experience. And they said, oh, I think I'm going to use this when I start thinking about, my chemistry classes. And, so they were seeing some connections between how they could visualize and see based on their dance experience, what these elements, how these elements behave.
Courtney, I know you have something to add here.
Yeah, I'm looking at the questions and the comments, and we want to know some examples, and we also want to know how we can buy in and get support, and these ideas of labels. I would say presenting a problem and coming up with a solution. And I can give an example of how I've done that in my work. The problem was coronavirus taking away high school experiences like art shows and choirs and plays. So how can we solve this problem? So it's an amazing experience where the Hirshhorn Museum wanted to step in and have me teach the whole district, all of DC. And which was an amazing act in itself, to where that, since it's a virtual class, any student could take it, but they wanted to focus on the inner city students of Washington, DC. So we're going to solve this problem of not having any showcasing. So we're going to focus on building a virtual reality space. And I'm teaching the students through Hubs Mozilla how to build this architectural space. And I'm sure we know, but I will go ahead and touch on how it touches the science, studying the proportions, the movement, understanding light. You're having a building here and it doesn't make sense with the light. If this is supposed to be 12 o'clock, we have to understand how the light reflects with the proportions and the perspectives with the shadow and reflective surfaces. Technology, we're on a computer. We have VR headsets and we're using the software to design this space to solve this problem. And again, I want to touch back that buy-in is seeing a problem in the community, and everyone agrees that we're missing these events, and that's the buy-in right there. And the engineering, obviously the designing and building the digital space, the math, the coding, is we need to understand the graphs of the Y and the X axis. If we have this house that's underneath the horizon line, that doesn't make sense. So we want to alter that. Or do we want to play with that? Since it's virtual reality, it doesn't have to be how reality is. Once we understand reality, we can alter it and play with that idea. And nowhere did I directly mention the label of art, because art is all encompassing of all of these disciplines. So, to having those conversations of what's a problem, how we can solve it together, I think you get buy-in.
Great. So the next question that I had was about parents and educators and sort of nurturing interest in both STEM and the arts in children. And I was wondering about things that your own parents might have done with you. I know some of you have spoken a little bit about this, or things that you may have done with young people in your life as examples. Nabiha, I know you have some things to say on this. Could you start us off?
Yes, would love to. And I believe my parents are actually watching this. They're in Bangladesh right now. So hi, parents. Thank you for always supporting me in all of my creative endeavors. My parents are both, well, my dad's a retired Foreign Service officer, and my mom is an elementary school teacher for over 30 years. She's a social worker by training, and she's a musician. She could have been professional if she wanted. Growing up, it was never a question if I could do all of the things I was passionate about and explore my creative self. And anytime I had a new direction, my mom fully supported that, whether it was towards theater or music or writing, and of course with science as well. So that was my norm growing up. And it was interesting. I studied at a lot of international schools growing up in Saudi Arabia, Germany, Sri Lanka. And even at that early age, I definitely felt some tension between the two worlds at school. If I wanted to pursue both, it was quite shocking to people, whether it was my classmates or my teachers. But thankfully, I had this really wonderful support system at home from my mom, and I just didn't care, and I did both. And I've also noticed as I've climbed up the ladders through my physics training, the level of scrutiny that scientists face many times, and whether or not they care about art, it's very taboo. And in college, I was president of the Model United Nations team. It was my big extracurricular activity, and I competed nationally for it. But yeah, a lot of my physics professors were quite upset that I was spending time on developing these other skills. And one of my physics professors at the time, Dr. Family, I took many of his class, and he's a super famous, celebrated physicist who also happens to be an artist, a painter. So I got lunch with him one day because I was asking him, Dr. Family, I don't understand why is everybody in the physics department upset that I'm doing other things? My physics is going great. I'm writing a 2-part thesis. I think I'm on track to get highest honors. Like, what's the issue? He said, Nabia, that's what's sad about the world. I recently hired a professor to this department who was saying awful things about art in our faculty room. And I didn't know how to react because other people were engaging with him. So my secret is I don't tell my physics colleagues about my art, but my artist colleagues love that I'm a physicist and they celebrate it. And that was so depressing in so many ways, but at some level, I did have to take that advice from him and be different in the scientific communities that I was working in as I was building my career. And now I'm at a point where I run my own company. I finished my formal training, so I can speak freely about how much I love both. And that's it, whether people like it or not. And I think that's important. And I think more of us who are in different career trajectories need to speak up about the importance of both. So, yeah.
Anybody else want to talk about this, about encouraging both in kids and things that helped you when you were young?
I can speak to a shift point for me in my understanding of science and art as both distinct and also as potentially integrated spaces. For me, I, as a kid, was very creative and really enjoyed doing the arts, as I mentioned earlier. But I loved like what I think of as like my trifecta of science. That was dinosaurs, space, and rocks. Like obsessed with all of them. And so I it was interesting because as a young girl and growing up in the South, I grew up in Tennessee. I was always encouraged on the creative side of things, and I was never really encouraged with the science side of things. And so I started leaning into my sort of creative, and I'm using art and creativity sort of synonymously here, but we've already talked about creativity is really embedded in both. So I started sort of pursuing that side of the world. And then when I got to college, fell in love with psychology, which was like my gateway drug to neuroscience. And then what I found though was that I swung as far as I could in the other direction. I almost like reinforced that dichotomy in myself. And it's because of how I saw the two. It's because of the messaging I got from society about what each one was. And to Nabiha's point, that they were mutually exclusive. And it wasn't until I taught a course about 10 years ago now on brain research and society, and I had to figure out how to make neuroscience and brain science exciting and accessible to my students. And it was, there was a lot of glazed over eyes. Somebody said like the thing that brains hate the most is learning about brains. And I was like, all right, how am I going to make this make sense? And we ended up doing an exercise where students built a brain, and they could do it however they wanted to. They could create a drawing. They could, one student made it out of balloons. It was amazing. There were some really incredible creations. But the point was that the art gave them a sense of ownership, gave them a sense of engagement and excitement. I saw one of the comments talks about play. There was an element of play there as well, which was incredibly engaging for them. But equally important, it also gave them insight into neural structures. It helped them understand better. And this is, Vanessa can speak to the history of that as a tool for inquiry and understanding. It helped them understand the layers, the positions in a way that was engaging and had ownership. And so for me, that was a huge shift point, was the realization that yes, they're distinct, but also there's all of this opportunity for them to be integrated. And I don't have to, it was a really important moment in my life for me to realize that I don't have to choose. You can be and do both. So.
Anybody else on this question? We can move along. I'm seeing a question here that's really interesting about how can we build workplaces that provide incentives for creative and artistic thinking in business situations or challenges. So taking this beyond school, once you're in the working world, has anybody seen this working successfully or been part of that in a workplace? How do those things get supported, and why do they work well? Do we need more of that?
I think the power of design thinking has been a little bit more accepted in companies through workshops where you get everyone together from different departments. You come together and you draw on the whiteboard, you draw on sticky notes, and you're sort of encouraged to break away from a computer and put your thoughts down in different ways and then talk about it. And so while it's not, I don't know if some people might consider that art, because what I've heard throughout my career at certain companies is as soon as you ask people to draw, they say, I'm not an artist, I don't draw. And it's like, just put something down on paper and we're not going to judge you for it. This isn't judging, this is a design thinking exercise. And once they break out of that and they do it, they don't realize that they've been using artistic practices to sort of free their brain and look at things from a different angle. So I think, again, design thinking, part of that artistry is working its way into company culture and is just becoming more accepted.
I naturally have spaces that are all art focused, but I would imagine it's similar to school where it's important to be intentional where art already is, and that divide of this is art and this is not art, showing where art is already used and being more intentional in how to not accidentally stumble upon using art and be intentional with it. So you're saving time and you can get to the solution quicker and more efficiently.
So maybe we can move on to the storytelling, which we popped up a couple of times. So this is a skill that's associated with arts and humanities. Why would a scientist or engineer need to be able to tell stories? And Stephanie, we're going to ask you to lead us on that answer.
Yeah, this is so interesting to think about that we associate storytelling, something as universal as storytelling, with a particular discipline or set of disciplines. Because when I think about storytelling, I think of it as our default mode of communication throughout human history, right? Like as a species, through song, through paintings on cave walls, through the ways that we sort of capture information that we think of as particularly valuable and pass it on to the next generation. It's all through storytelling. And it has been for a really long time. Storytelling in my mind is about making information usable. It is beyond just a skill. It's a way of structuring information so that it's more accessible to the person that you want to sort of pass knowledge on to or co-create knowledge with. And I think from that perspective, we should all become storytellers. I think we all are to differing degrees. I think we naturally pass information on through the sort of coat of story in our day-to-day lives. And what's interesting about scientists on this front is they're already telling stories. I mean, I know in my lab where I was working for years, we talked about story all the time. It was just that we talked about story through the lens of, okay, what's the story in the data? How do we sort of find the story through this data? And it was, I think there's this misconception that story isn't true necessarily. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think it's a method for structuring to make information usable. I don't think it's making it less true. And so in science, that's how it's seen, right? How do I capture the story from the data so that I can get published or so that I can get funding? And I think the problem is not that scientists aren't storytellers. It's actually, it kind of pulls together the threads throughout this panel so far of, it's that scientists don't necessarily, as a community and as an institution right now, value storytelling for public exploration and public engagement with their science. And so I think it's more of a value question. How do we make sure that we're prioritizing storytelling to make science itself more usable? Because we know that's so important right now. I mean, it's always been important, but STEM is increasingly shaping society. We need to make sure that members of the general public are active in that discourse. And one of the most powerful ways to do that is to take the science and translate it into digestible and meaningful stories. And that doesn't have to be scientists. That can be scientists respecting and valuing story and working with storytellers to do that. I think that that is a growing field that is great. I call them the in-betweeners. I think it's great. We need more in-betweeners. And I think of equal importance is that part of that space be co-created with the public, because I think as important as it is for scientists to tell stories about their work or to support storytelling about their work, it's just as important that they hear stories from the public, from the communities that are being impacted or potentially impacted by that work. So creating sort of interactive, multidimensional, bidirectional storytelling and valuing that, I think, would be a transformational cultural change that I'd love to see.
And stories as being sticky, like that's the thing, that you hear the story and you remember it because it's told to you as a story and you can pass that along. I mean, that's a big part of journalism too. Companies are actually recruiting journalists to come work for them to tell the company story, like how do we explain what we're doing? How do we present this in a way that people can understand the impact that we're having? And, not just like the annual report, but like the how this reaches into communities and how we're affecting the world around us and things like that. Courtney, I think you have a show and tell for us and we would love to see it.
I do. I am also an AP art teacher. So I teach college level art, and a part of that evaluation is your sustained investigation. So you're documenting and processing and your storytelling of how you got there. As you just shared with us, the process is important, more important than how you got there. And in science, we know we're building off of the blocks of past sciences in the past. We're finding their journals and their sketchbooks, and we're critiquing, we're analyzing, and we're evaluating these documents. And I have my high school sketchbook here, and it's gold. It's pure gold to have this storytelling of the past and how I got to where I am. And you want to be able to have that tangible documentation. And that's also part of the buy-in. We keep talking about how do we get people to buy in. You don't want to just show, oh, here it is. What did you grapple with? Can I see the growth? You started here and you turned here. What made you do that? So that's vital. Yeah. So I love this discussion.
So that's what you're doing that with your AP students, encouraging them to create these. And
yes, process is 60% of the exam. So they want to see your sketchbook. They want to see your writings. They want to see you cut a picture from a magazine. What about that picture made you stop and think? Process doesn't have to be drawing. It's writing, it's collecting, it's analyzing your thoughts, and it's collaborative. So we want to have that in an organized way. then show the end result. But it's like those art pieces, you see the circle, the red circle. Oh, what is that? That's not art. They just threw a red circle up there. But if we explain what that red circle is and how that red circle came from that person's childhood, and it gives a better story to the process.
So Ashare, do you have something to add here? You're smiling about
I
storytelling.
am smiling. I think, well, in education, we're doing a lot of science notebooks now in schools and elementary school, which I think is just really important. And the idea of making sure that we're paying attention to the different scientific practices, and having some place to really show the growth and development, and to put your questions or to put your scientific drawings in, or to go back after you were looking at a plant on day 1 and what it looks like on day 35, and see the difference in terms of changes. I think that kind of documentation can be really helpful in learning, and it's definitely what I see both in art disciplines and in scientific disciplines. So it's nice to see the connection.
Anybody else want to jump in on this?
I just wanted to add just my take on that original question you asked, Veronica. Why is this storytelling important to scientists and engineers? And I will say 90% of my job right now as a CEO of a technology company is storytelling. That's what I do, to recruit people, to fundraise, to draw in partnerships. That's all it is. And it was quite an interesting transition going from my scientific training, where it was frowned upon to share personal details or your motivations or your passions. Really, you just want to, like Stephanie said, find the story in the data and create a very focused story around your data. But when you're building a company, it's so much broader than that. It's about, how do we change the world? Why is this science going to save hundreds of thousands of lives? And that's what it's about. And that's what investors are funding. So I had to go through that training process and journey over the past couple of years to get comfortable with that aspect of storytelling again. And I wish I'd been trained in it sooner. That would have been easier for me.
One of the comments in the chat I see that people are liking is process equals storytelling equals sharing equals inspiration. To that.
You've got to share. You got to share. It's sometimes very sensitive. You don't want to show you made a mistake, and you have to be vulnerable. Absolutely, I agree with that.
And I love that, Courtney, that point about being vulnerable, because I think that's another incredibly powerful potential that storytelling in STEM has, is to our I Am a Scientist campaign, for example. We tell the stories of scientists, not necessarily the ones you'd expect to hear. We talk about their failures. We talk about the things that were really hard for them. We focus and zoom in on vulnerability in a way that only good storytelling can really do. You don't get that in a textbook written in sort of the old school conventional ways. And I think that gives storytelling the potential to help us shift stereotypes and misconceptions and assumptions, so that more students can see not just themselves in these fields, but really get a better sense of what it means to be a leader in those fields. And that is creative, and that is curious in equal parts.
Mm-hmm. And I would just add that, in a lot of art-based experiences, failure is out in the open in certain disciplines. Like, I know that, dancing and we're together, we're developing our work, and we're out for public critique. And in fact, that's a thing that we look and we evaluate each other, and we see it as part of our own success and failure, and what that what kind of results or learning or exposures does that, kind of give in terms of an impact to who I am as a learner and how I can go back the next time and try again, right? So like if that environment happens to be a positive one where I can learn with my group, then that, but I also know that, dance can be very competitive. And so then what does that breed? And, and how do I navigate that? But I think that the same is obviously true. We have critique in the sciences, and getting that kind of feedback, and being able to be okay with failure is incredibly important to making informed next decisions in our process, right? So I think that those pieces are often, like you said, that story's not being told. We get the very long, results of the success, but all of the, years of work that it took us to get there, is a little bit hidden. And like you were saying earlier, we need to be more aware, especially, I think now in schools, of like understanding that it is process and we need to value process. It's very important.
Yeah, I think it's this idea of this whole conversation around process is so important for kids to understand as they go out and interview for jobs, right? So as somebody that has regularly hired designers, I'm actually not interested in your final piece of work in your portfolio. I'm more interested in how you got there. What was the research that you did? What was the psychology behind the colors that you chose? Where did you fail and start again or pivot? That is so much more important to me than the final polished product that you put out there in the world, because it helps me to understand how you think and how you think and collaborate with others to get to that final piece. And that incorporates and necessitates storytelling.
That is fascinating. So I think we are coming to the end of our discussion part of this, and I'm sorry, but we have a lot of questions that we haven't gotten to. But this was a really, really interesting discussion. I learned so much. I hope everybody here did too. Before I hand it back to Olu, we were going to go back to the Venn diagram and just sort of invite people to share in our chat, things that they may have revised from the beginning of the discussion. And I wonder if some of the panelists could talk about, like, I'm sort of interested in that middle, the overlap. Like, can you share some of the words that are in the middle of your Venn diagram with those two circles? Anybody willing to?
I'd love to mention this exercise. We use it with the Plenary Co, but it was actually inspired by a Venn diagram that was created by Christine Liu of Two Photon Art. And for her initial diagram, one of the words that was in the middle that I loved was wonder. So I just wanted to pass that along, because I feel like that's a really sort of beautiful meeting point of art and science.
Yeah. Anybody else with words that here we have some of our participants. Art is practice, both as color, sound, awards, and competition. Sci, visualization. Celebrity, science is epistemology. Any of our panelists on what is in the center of your Venn diagram?
I have materials, and I have studio safety. And that's definitely studio space, and how to clean and properly keep safe is important for both, and understanding what happens when in protection.
One of my words is beauty. I know that you don't think about math necessarily as being beautiful, but I have heard it described that way by mathematicians. There's a depth and beauty to problems and solving problems.
Absolutely agree with that. Yeah, math, beautiful, elegant. I would use all of those words. But yeah, a lot of my words that fall in the middle of the Venn diagram: creativity, dedication, fun, challenging, projects, teamwork. Those are the words I have. But I don't have any words in the different parts of the Venn diagram other than just in the middle. I'm totally biased. So all my words are going in the middle.
I have rigor and thinking practices.
We already spoke about it, but just to double down, process and documentation.
What about rules? Are there rules in both, or yeah?
Yeah, I think there are rules in both, but there's also room to break rules in both.
Yeah.
And that's powerful because innovation happens when you break rules.
Yeah, and on that note, I think openness is one that I would put in the middle as well, because to that point, it's not always practiced, but I think that at its best, both in art and science, there is a culture and prioritization of staying as open as possible to new possibilities, new associations, new connections that may not have been seen before.
One of our attendees says discipline and grit. I love those. Definitely applicable to both. Okay, so we're going to stop there with the panelist discussion part and hand it back to Olu. Thank you so much to all 5 of you for sharing your insights and this lively, enlightening discussion that we promised. It's been a joy to talk with all of you, and I hope that we will meet again sometime. And thanks to everybody out there who listened in and contributed questions. I'm going to hand it back over to Olu to take us out.
Yes, thank you, Veronica. Masterful moderating. Thank you so much to you again. Vanessa, Courtney, Fola, Sade, Nabiha, Stephanie, thank you for sharing your time, expertise with us. I learned something new today and forever grateful for your contributions. I told you guys were in for a treat. So thank you again to our moderator and our panelists. And then lastly, thank you again to SoftWorld for being our visionary sponsor for this webinar series, and to the Boston Globe for being our media sponsor. We are so grateful to have you guys here again today. As part of the series, Kids in Tech is also hosting and partnering up with companies to host virtual experiments and presentations with kids and families. Our next Beyond the Microscope webinar series for young kids is called Pool Party. How does COVID testing work from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. on Monday, April 5th? It's going to be hosted by Ginkgo Bioworks. This event is for kids ages 10 and up, adults and community members alike. Please register at our website at kidsintech.org. Our next webinar conversation will be held on Wednesday, April 28th, and we will focus on the state of STEM education with policy experts and education experts. We will explore how can policy be used to drive educational equity for our nation's children. This panel will be moderated by Felicia Gans, digital producer and reporter from the Boston Globe, and you can register for this event at www.kidsintech.org. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate you being here, and we'll see you next time.